Hello and welcome to the splendid surroundings of Guildhall here in the heart of the City of London, where in the next half an hour we'll find out who's won one of the world's most important and most famous literary prizes, the Man Booker. Previous winners of this prize include Sir Salman Rushdie, Hilary Mantel and Kazuo Ishiguro, who just this month was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Other winners, including the Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul, A.S. Byatt, Julian Barnes and Ben Okri are here in the audience tonight. It's been quite a journey to get to this point. The judges read 144 books. They whittled them down to a long list of 13, a short list of 6. And tonight, there will be just one book left, one winner. This is a real highlight of the literary calendar. 500 guests here in the room, and among them the 6 authors shortlisted for the prize this year, waiting nervously to find out if they've won. This is, after all, a career-defining moment for any writer, and who knows, perhaps even beginning to think about the £50,000 cheque that goes with winning. We also have a royal guest here with us tonight. Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cornwall will be presenting the trophy to the winner. To help guide us through the proceedings, I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by the writer and critic Stephanie Merritt. Hi Stephanie, and by Samir Rahim, the books editor of Prospect magazine. Much to discuss and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you for being with us. Before that though, let's just remind ourselves who is on this year's shortlist.
6 of the best books of the year are competing for the Man Booker Prize for Fiction. 4321 is a very big book by one of America's big beasts, Paul Auster. It follows the 4 different paths a man's life might take. Ali Smith's Autumn is the first instalment of a seasonal quartet. It centres on 2 friends in the wake of the vote to leave the European Union and explores the themes and issues raised by the decision. Exit West by Mohsin Hamid is a book about migration and the refugee crisis. It tells the tale of a young couple who moved to different locations around the globe through mysterious black doors. There are 3 writers with their first novels. George Saunders is best known for short stories. Lincoln in the Bardo is about the death of Abraham Lincoln's 11-year-old son and the president's grief. It's set in a graveyard over a single night. Fiona Mozley works in a bookshop in York. Her novel Elmet is a family drama which explores the loss of rural community in northern England. And The History of Wolves by Emily Fridlund is set in northern Minnesota. It's a coming-of-age story about a teenage girl living in the remains of an old commune.
So let's have a look at those books in a little bit more detail now with Stephanie and Samir. And let's start with the most high-profile writer on the list this year, the American writer Paul Auster. Age of 70, he's written 17 novels, and 4321 looks at 4 different versions of one man's life. And Stephanie, when we think of a Paul Auster novel, I think we tend to think of a concise, punchy kind of novel. Here he is with his first novel for 7 years, nearly 900 pages. I know that has put some people off. Would that be a mistake?
Oh yes, don't be put off by the size of this. It is a beast of a book, but it's wonderfully rich with detail. It's, I think Auster at his finest, he's doing something quite different from what he's done before. It's a wide-ranging history of the last 50 or 60 years in America, and very, very funny, often tragic, but it's got a lot of that Auster tricksiness and playfulness that people like as well. So please don't be put off by the size of this. It's terrific.
Samir, it sounds like Stephanie loved it. I loved it. I loved its ambition and its complexity. I know not everyone does. One critic even dismissed it as a turkey. Was it a hit or a miss for you?
Well, this is a Marmite book, so some people love it and some people hate it. I think I was pretty lukewarm about it. The first 200 pages are pretty gripping. It takes you into immigrants going into Ellis Island. But when Ferguson, the main character, appears, it's quite an interesting character. But given that we have 4 versions of him throughout the whole book, we have 4 versions of his first girlfriend, we have 4 versions of his schooling. By the end, I wasn't really that gripped by the story or him. We didn't learn that much more about him, or indeed much about anyone else he interacted with. So although it is very weighty, when I tap it, it rings hollow.
OK, well, we will set Paul Auster to one side and move on to the Scottish writer Ali Smith and her novel Autumn. Now, she's been shortlisted for this prize before. This is her 7th novel, and it was written around the time of the European Union, the referendum to leave the European Union, and it's been described as the first post-Brexit novel. Would you agree?
Well, I'm sure our publishers were absolutely delighted when she said she was writing a post-Brexit novel. But I think that's slightly misleading. Yes, there is a character who does experience some unhappiness the day after the referendum, listening to Radio 4 as the result didn't go her way. But I think really what you get in an Ali Smith book and what you get here is a lot of humour. You get a very touching relationship between a younger woman and an older man, a platonic friendship, which is an unusual subject to take on. And I think really it's much more than a Brexit book.
I'm a big fan of Ali Smith, Stephanie, especially the way she writes. As I say, she's been shortlisted 4 times, never won up until now. I can't help wondering, though, if she did win tonight, would it be a case of right author, wrong book? Is this her best book?
I don't think this is her best book, and I say that with a degree of reservation, because I do love this book, and I think it's a terrific achievement considering she wrote it in about 8 months, or possibly less. And I think it's beautifully lyrical. It's perhaps not the crowning achievement of her career, but I think there's a lot of echoes of her previous work in there, so she would certainly be a worthy winner.
Yes, and it is beautifully written, that book. Another topical book is Exit West by Mohsin Hamid, another man who is not a stranger to this prize. He was shortlisted 10 years ago for his novel The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and this is a book about refugees and migration, and people move around the globe, Stephanie, through a series of mysterious black doors, so a degree of magical realism here. Did that work?
I think the magic realism aspect is actually the least successful part of this novel, but it's an interesting choice to make because so often I think when we think about literature that is about migration or about refugees, we hear a lot about the journey, and the journey is often the most arduous and difficult part of that migrant experience. And what he's done here is to cut the journey out of the story altogether, so people walk through a door into another life. So what he's really interested in exploring here is that sense of dislocation, of coming from one world and having to reinvent yourself immediately without a transition process. So, I mean, it's an interesting device.
He's exploring very big issues in this book, Samir, but actually in a very slender volume. It's the shortest book on the shortlist this year. What did you make of it?
I think it was very impressive in many ways. I mean, it tackles the big issue, possibly the biggest issue of our time. I mean, what happens when you have a group of traumatized individuals from one country who are forced to flee and end up in another place? What kind of consequences does it have for them? There's a line in the book talking about how refugees murder a part of themselves when they leave a country. And it's also about what happens to the native people in the country they move to and the unsettling feelings they may have about new immigrants coming in.
The formal proceedings of the evening are just getting going behind us, but we'll just carry on chatting for a bit longer if that's all right. And let's move on to the second American on the shortlist this year, George Saunders. Now, he is a very accomplished short story writer, but Lincoln in the Bardo is his first full-length novel at the age of 58. And Samir, I think you've got to explain the slightly strange and possibly off-putting title.
Well, we know who Lincoln is,
yes.
The famous American president. The Bardo is a Tibetan word for a sort of netherworld between the living and the dead. Essentially, it's sort of narrated by ghosts.
Which sounds crazy. Does it work?
It sounds crazy. You open the book, it looks very strange typographically on the page, but like any great book, and I think this is a great book, it teaches you how to read it very quickly. It's a huge pleasure to read. It's funny, it's heartfelt. It's centered around a dead child and a touching relationship between Lincoln and his son. Perhaps it does slightly veer into sentimentality at points, but I mean, for an author who is giving you jokes, heartfelt emotion, touch of mysticism, what more could you want?
Yes. Samir thinks it's a great book. The judges said it was an extraordinary achievement. The bookmaker's favourite. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think this is a wonderful book. It's easy to see as well why this would have appealed to this particular panel of judges. I think it's very theatrical in its nature. It almost looks like a play script on the stage, on the page. Sorry, it's like a collage, almost like a collage of voices. It's certainly the most stylistically experimental and playful of all the novels, but it's shot through with Saunders' very particular humour. But it's a book about grief and loss and about trying to come to terms with what it means to be human and to lose somebody. And I think it's really very beautifully done.
Yes. Let's move on to Elmet by Fiona Mozley. Now, this book is the one that's grabbed all the headlines, a first novel. She wrote the first chapter on her phone while on a train. How much of an achievement is it for a first novel, Stephanie?
Oh, I think it's a tremendous achievement for a first novel, and it's a book that's certainly very conscious of its literary antecedents. The title is straight from Ted Hughes. There are strong echoes as well of Jez Butterworth's play Jerusalem in it. It's a book about landscape and about our place in the landscape. I'm not sure that it would have made quite so many headlines if it hadn't been a first novel. And it's perhaps a slightly controversial choice given some of the books that were left off from the original long list.
Samira, I thought it was an unusual book, but I know there are people who've been somewhat underwhelmed by it. Were you?
Oh, no, it's an impressive achievement, definitely, for a first novel. And the echoes of Wuthering Heights and Ted Hughes are all there. There's some beautiful landscape descriptions, and she really can write. I felt that maybe she packed all the action into the last 70 pages of it, and then it gets a little bit over-dramatic, and maybe if she'd sort of spread that out over 300 pages, it would have been a better balanced book.
Well, last but by no means least, another first novel, History of Wolves, by the third American on the shortlist this year, Emily Fridlund. And this is a sort of mystery thriller of sorts about a young woman who falls in with some strange neighbours. And we know from the outset, Samir, that a tragedy has occurred. Does she manage to maintain the narrative tension throughout the rest of the novel?
Yes, more dead children. There seems to be a theme in this year's list. I'm not quite sure if she does. Right from the title, with evocative of wolves, I think wolves are quite a common metaphor used in novels and books, and they seem to be coming across my desk all the time. I felt like this was very competently done. It was something that was certainly proficiently written, but for me, given she was tackling things which are really quite familiar, it didn't really stand out. It wasn't really bold enough for me.
Stephanie, did it deserve its place on the list?
Well, I would agree. I think this is probably the slightest book on the list, and it is surprising to me that it's found its way on there. I think it's a book that promises things that it doesn't quite deliver, although it is extremely accomplished for a first novel. But I never found the narrative voice entirely convincing, and as you say, it starts off with the promise of a thriller and the promise of a tragedy to be uncovered, and then the reveal comes a little too early, I think, or the tension isn't quite maintained.
Yes.
I do apologise. We've lost our feed to the Booker Prize event, which we were just watching. Of course, we're working very quickly to resolve that. We are expecting the result, where are we? In about 10 minutes' time, so hopefully we can fix that before we can reconnect to the Guildhall and continue hearing about the books which have made their way from the long list onto the short list, and of course one of those shortlisted authors will take away one of the most coveted prizes in literature. And it's not just available now to British writers, available to writers from around the world, which has meant that the Booker Prize has picked up even more attention than it would have done beforehand. So we're working hard to bring you more from the Booker Prize announcement. In the meantime, let me quickly turn to a story that's getting a lot of attention since it emerged a little while ago. Britain faces the highest rate of terror attacks in the last 30 years, with some plots hatched in just days and 3,000 extremists currently being investigated. That's according to the head of MI5, Andrew Parker, who's given a rare interview and defended the service's record after 4 terrorist attacks this year. Our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, reports.
4 terrorist attacks in Britain, inspired by so-called Islamic State, in the space of 6 months. Most of the attackers were already known to MI5, the security service. Today, its Director General addressed journalists on the extent of the current threat.
We've seen a dramatic upshift in threat this year. It's at the highest tempo I've seen in my 34-year career.
I asked him why MI5 was unable to stop those attacks by known extremists.
The likelihood is that sometimes attacks can happen. We've seen that. I've also said the likelihood is that when an attack happens, it may be done by somebody that we know or have known at some point in the past. Were that not so, it would mean that we were looking completely in the wrong place.
When 3 men attacked people with a van and knives in Southwark in June, it turned out their ringleader was this man, Khurram Butt, a well-known extremist already on MI5's radar.
What's the point of surveillance if someone is free to do that?
One of the main challenges we've got is that we only ever have fragments of information, and we have to try to assemble a picture of what might happen based on those fragments. Sometimes I've talked about today pinpricks of light in an otherwise dark canvas. We have to make professional judgments about where to commit resource based on the best knowledge we've got each day against that whole range of extremists.
MI5's list of 3,000 extremists includes returnees, jihadists coming back from the conflict zone. I asked Andrew Parker if he knew where they are now and what they're doing.
So of that, over 800 people who have gone to Syria and Iraq, a proportion of them are back in the UK from several years ago, having given up on the fighting and come back for different reasons.
And you're monitoring them?
And they are part of that 3,000 number I spoke about, where they're sifted and assessed on an individual basis for risk, and we apply intelligence coverage and police coverage accordingly.
MI5 says its Director General cannot be 100% perfect. A total of 5 terrorist attacks have got through this year, against 20 stopped over 4 years. The UK, he says, will face down this challenging threat. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
Now, we're still trying to make a connection to the Booker Prize announcement. So while we're doing that, let me tell you about another story relating to Brexit. Reversing Brexit and staying in the EU would significantly boost the UK economy. That's according to a new report by the international think tank, the OECD. It concludes that leaving the EU with no deal would see business investment seize up and the pound hit new lows. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, said the UK is trying for a deal, but must be prepared to walk away without one. Here's John Pina. Well, John's report will wait because the better news is that we've made a connection to the Booker Prize ceremony. Let's listen in.
For faith on this book, for which I'll be forever grateful. It's been a profound honor to be on the same shortlist with my new friends, Paul, Emily, Mohsin, Fiona, and Ali. In each of your books, I found a wonderful soul, uniquely embodied in refined prose. I will never forget the gift of being here beside you. I want to thank the Man Booker Prize, the chair, and the prize judges for their incredibly hard work. I'd also like to thank all the critics who wrote about the book, all of them, and also especially all of the booksellers who sold it. When I had about the first third of the book written, I got a little freaked out by reading what I had written. And I thought, well, this has been a lot of fun up till now. I wonder if any other human being could actually understand it. So as I often do in a crisis, I turned to my wife, who on a Post-it note after reading that first third wrote me something so generous that it will stay a secret forever, but gave me the confidence to go on. So thank you, Paula, precious friend, visionary, artistic hero, my guide always to the higher ground, even when I have to go there kicking and screaming. Thanks also to our dear daughters, Caitlin and Elena, who've taught me through their kindness and dignity all there is to know about the deep spiritual rewards of parenting. As you might have noticed, we live in a strange time. I've noticed it. So the question at the heart of the matter, I think, is pretty simple. Do we respond to fear with exclusion and negative projection and violence, or do we take that ancient great leap of faith and do our best to respond with love, and with faith in the idea that what seems other is actually not other at all, but just us on a different day? In the US now, we're hearing a lot about the need to protect culture. Well, this tonight is culture. It's international culture, it's compassionate culture, it's activist culture. It's a room full of believers through the word in ambiguity and beauty, and in trying to see the other person's point of view, even when that's hard. Believers in working to eliminate hatred and meanness and lazy habitual thinking, even when, especially when, we find these in ourselves. In I Stand Here Ironing, a story by the great American writer Tilly Olsen, the main character utters a kind of prayer for her daughter, thinking of the hardships this girl has had to endure because of their poverty. A prayer that, for me, encapsulates the highest aspirations of literature. She says, "Only help her to know, help make it so there is cause for her to know that she is more than just this dress on the ironing board, helpless before the iron." Well, the iron is upon us, friends, all over the world, so help us to know, help make it through our actions and the products of our imagination, so that there is cause for us to know, and for others to know, that we are not helpless before the iron, and will not tolerate anyone else being made helpless before it either. Thank you so very much for this great honor, which I hope to live up to with the rest of my work for the rest of my life. Thank you.
Gracious acceptance speech there by the American writer George Saunders, who has won the 2017 Man Booker Prize for fiction for his novel Lincoln in the Bardo. He's a very acclaimed short story writer, but now at the age of 58, he's written his first full-length novel, and look what he's gone and done. Won one of the biggest prizes in publishing. I'm delighted to say that the writer and critic Stephanie Merritt and the books editor of Prospect magazine, Samir Rahim, are still with me. Well, you both tipped him. A worthy winner, Stephanie?
Oh, absolutely. I'm really thrilled about this. I think he's such a terrific writer, and this is such a humane and beautiful book, and so full of heart, and it does feel absolutely relevant to the times we're living through, as he was saying in his speech. So I'm really pleased about this, yeah.
He's written 9 books, as I say. He's very well known. He's won prizes for his short stories. He's not really a household name in the UK, though, is he, Samir? What kind of difference do you think this will make to a writer like him?
Well, he's won prizes before, and I'm sure he'll win prizes again in the future. I'm absolutely delighted that he's won. He's a fantastic writer. I mean, he has 166 voices in this book, and he makes you care about every single one. Each one has its own back history. Each one has its own life to it. And I think that's what makes him such a remarkable writer. And he wrote a wonderful piece last summer in the New Yorker magazine when he talked to Trump supporters, a group of people who are not often given a voice and with an empathetic turn of an ear. And he managed to try and understand what might be motivating them, what might they be thinking. And I think it's an extension of that in this book, really, which he's been thinking about for 20 years.
Yes, it is an unconventional book, an experimental one, certainly the most experimental on the whole of the shortlist this year. And I do think that people picking it up for the first time might be a bit put off by it. Do you know what I mean? Presumably you'd encourage them to keep going.
Oh yes, I mean certainly the first few pages you have absolutely no idea what's going on or who's speaking, and gradually it almost mirrors the experience of these ghostly voices taking shape and becoming, we start to get to know them, we recognise their different turns of phrase, and as Samir says, we do get to care about all of these different characters. So although it may look daunting at first, it's the sort of book you have to immerse yourself in, I think, and very quickly you'll start to learn to love it. I hope so.
And these voices are in the Bardo largely, which is this Tibetan state of being between life and death. And of course we're there because Abraham Lincoln's beloved 11-year-old son Willie has died. Now it seems to me that writing about Abraham Lincoln for an American writer is probably a bit like writing about Jesus. I mean, he's somewhat revered, isn't he? Does he ever tip over into sort of sentimentality for this great American hero?
I think it's a danger with Lincoln, the granite sort of face of America, great monument. I think if I were to have one slight criticism of the book, I would say that perhaps it does tip over. Whenever you're dealing with a dead child in any kind of novel, it always has to be dealt with very, very carefully. But it's more than compensated for by the wonderful humour in the book. It's so funny.
That's what I was going to mention, Stephanie. I mean, it is funny, isn't it? He manages to make such a serious subject comical. How does he do it?
Well, I think it's partly through this chorus of voices, which he described as a Greek chorus, and some of them have sort of quite grotesque physical attributes, which we won't go into on a family show, but and so they're quite comical characters, but I think it's worth mentioning that it is also a political novel, because Lincoln's son died in the middle of the Civil War, and when Lincoln goes to visit the graveside, he is often thinking about these decisions that he's got to make, these huge decisions that will impact, with the deaths of possibly hundreds of thousands of other people while he's dealing with his own grief. And so it's a novel about a divided America, which I think has great resonance. And so I think through the humour, there's also quite serious points that he's making.
I must ask you both about the fact that another American writer has won this novel, the second in succession after Paul Beatty won last year for The Sellout. It's of course 4 years since the rules were changed to enable American writers to enter the prize. Are we seeing the creeping Americanization of the prize, and does it matter?
Well, I think possibly we are, and there's certainly been criticisms made that what we're not hearing, certainly on this shortlist this year, we're not hearing those voices from perhaps other parts of the Commonwealth, which we used to get quite regularly on the Booker shortlists. And perhaps some of these American giants of the likes of Paul Auster and now George Saunders are possibly crowding out the possibility of finding new voices from less well-known markets. So I was reluctant to, not that they asked me, but I was reluctant to have Americans included. And I think, if this becomes a trend, it will seem a shame, I think, perhaps if we do lose that sense of more of a kind of patchwork of voices from other parts of the world.
Do you agree, Samir?
Well, I think there was a lot of grumbling from authors who then thought there'd be less opportunity for them to get on the shortlist. I think as from a reader's point of view, I don't think they care whether a book is from the UK or America or Australia or wherever. They're just interested in the best book that has been recommended to them by a panel of judges who have read all the books that have been published this year. So I think in a way it has enriched the prize, and we've had a wonderful winner this year which we wouldn't have had without that.
But in both your view, Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders is the best book of the year?
Oh, I do. Well, I think it's probably the best book of this list. Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily the best book of the year, but it's certainly, according to the judges, it is. But I think it's an absolutely worthy winner.
Yeah, Samir?
Absolutely, a worthy winner, and yeah, I'd recommend people to go and read it.
Okay, well, recommendations. Thank you both so much for your insights, Samir, Rahim and Stephanie Merritt. It's been lovely talking to you. I do understand that we have had some technical issues during this programme. I'm so sorry, but I do hope that you did hear George Saunders with his wonderful acceptance speech for his novel Lincoln in the Bardo, which has won the Man Booker Prize for fiction. He's 58, he's written his first full-length novel, although he says this novel has been in his heart for 20 years. From all of us here at the Guildhall, thank you so much for watching, and good night.